Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you can please take your seats, we're required to have a safety briefing for the Hyatt. So if you can just pay attention for the next few minutes while we have the safety briefing. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols observed, and welcome to Hyatt Regency Trinidad. I am Theo from the Safety and Security Department. Here at Hyatt Regency Trinidad, your safety and well-being during your time with us is our first priority. Therefore, it is essential that you are familiar with our evacuation protocols. Should it become necessary to evacuate the hotel, a continuous siren will sound, followed by an audible instruction to evacuate the building. When you hear, "May I have your attention, please," over the public announcement system, you should proceed orderly towards the exit closest to you and make your way to the muster point proceeding east along the waterfront towards the western end of the Femme de Charlie, better known as the Breakfast Shed. In the event of an earthquake, do not run out of the building. Stay calm, drop, cover, and hold on. If an evacuation is required, please listen for instructions via the hotel's PA system for the earthquake evacuation route and muster point. Associates from Hyatt will assist you in evacuating. Once outside, conduct a head count for your group to ensure that everyone is accounted for. Should you believe someone is missing, notify the Hyatt associate in your area. Do not return to the building for any reason until the fire services have stated it is safe to do so. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic policy, we kindly ask that you wear your masks in all public areas of the hotel. Make sure to wash your hands and maintain social distancing of 6 feet. Thank you, be safe, and do have an enjoyable time with us.
Thank you very much. Dr. Alvin Hilaire, Governor and Chairman of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Gregory Hill, Managing Director of Answer Merchant Bank Limited and Director of the American Chamber of Commerce for Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Gerardo Noto, the resident representative of the United Nations Development Program in Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Victor Gauto, country economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. Raymond Prasad, economist in the UN Resident Coordinator Office for Trinidad and Tobago, Aruba, Curacao, and St. Martin. Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, High Commissioners, and representatives of the governments of Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Colombia, eventually the European Union. He's going to be arriving late. Japan, the Republic of Korea, Mexico, the Netherlands, Peru, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Representatives of the governments of Trinidad and Tobago, including permanent secretaries, deputy permanent secretaries, and other policymakers. Representatives of international development partners, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the CAF Development Bank of Latin America, and multiple United Nations agencies, funds, and programs. Representatives from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, representatives from the private sector, academia, and the media, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. To maximize time for discussions, henceforth all protocols will be observed and speakers will not be required to give additional salutations. My name is Mark Thomas. I am the interim team leader in the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office, and I will be your master of ceremonies this morning. Welcome to what is intended to be the first of a series of seminars for public and more targeted audiences, hosted not by individual UN agencies or small groups of agencies, but by all 18 UN agencies, funds, and programs with a presence in Trinidad and Tobago, functioning as one UN. And what a launchpad this series is having today, for we are honored, deeply honored, to have the Central Bank Governor, the Managing Director of one of the country's leading financial institutions, and the country economist of one of the region's main international development partners as today's speakers. I will give you the biography of the speakers today. Dr. Alvin Hilaire is the governor and chairman of the board of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. He has previously held positions as chief economist and deputy governor at the bank. Dr. Hilaire spent 13 years at the International Monetary Fund, where he served as the fund's senior economist and worked on IMF financial programs and surveillance in many countries. He currently serves as alternate director of the CAF Development Bank of Latin America, the chairman of the board of the Deposit Insurance Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, and as Trinidad and Tobago's representative on the Financial Stability Board, Regional Consultative Group for the Americas. Dr. Hilaire holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in economics from Columbia University in New York. Gerardo Noto is a resident representative ad interim in the United Nations Development Program in Trinidad and Tobago. A citizen of Argentina and Spain, Mr. Noto has 30 years' experience in public service, human development, and democratic governance. Prior to joining the UN system in 2002, Mr. Noto worked in international relations and international cooperation at government, multi-country institutions in Argentina, Spain, and Venezuela, and he lectured in international relations and negotiations at 3 universities. He obtained a master's degree in law and diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of Tufts Harvard University. Gregory Hill is the Managing Director of Answer Merchant Bank. Mr. Hill is also Chairman of Answer Merchant Bank Barbados and a Director on the boards of TATIL and the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago. He is chairman of the Alumni Association of the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business, where he graduated as the top MBA student upon completing his executive MBA. He is a fellow of the Association of Chartered Accountants, Chartered and Certified Accountants of the UK, and a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Trinidad and Tobago. Victor Gauto is the country economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. Prior to joining the IDB, Mr. Gauto was an economics consultant in the private sector in Paraguay and worked in the Department of Taxes of the state government of Vermont. He also lectured in macroeconomics and international trade at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. Dr. Gauto holds a PhD in applied economics and a master's in public policy, both from the University of Minnesota. To start today's proceedings, I now invite Gerardo Noto, resident representative of the UNDP, to give opening remarks on behalf of the Trinidad and Tobago UN country team and to introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here on behalf of the UN country team to open this important workshop. Mr. Governor for Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, colleagues from the panel, UN colleagues, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UN, good morning and welcome to this seminar. The global economic landscape is changing rapidly as we were heading for recovery from the impact of COVID-19 in early 2021. The global economy was weighed down by a confluence of calamities. This is in large part was attributed to the mounting economic pressure from the war in Ukraine and the many consequences of the war on the global economy. These conditions have led to weaker than expected global economic conditions and rising elevated level of inflation across the globe, as well as disrupting the food, energy, and transport sector, among others. In response, the global central banks have aggressively raised the policy interest rates over the past year to tackle high inflation in their economies. Despite these efforts, inflation in relative terms has remained persistently high and has broadened beyond energy and food commodity prices globally and in the Caribbean. The transmission of high food prices has exacerbated the living costs of conditions for the poor and the most vulnerable in society through eroding away their limited purchasing power and exposing their food insecurity. These effects resonate across the different spheres of their lives, such as leading to nutritional deficiency. Definitely, the multi-level crisis impact everyone, but particularly the most vulnerable. These economic and social shifts are causing major global disruptions. As for the first time in 32 years, in 1990, the Human Development Index has declined globally for 2 years in a row, which measures this index, as you know, measures a nation's health, education, and standard of living of the people. Human development has fallen back to its 2016 levels, reversing much of the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which make up the 2030 agenda. This signals a deepening multi-level crisis for many regions, and Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia has been hit particularly hard. The domino effects of this higher policy interest rate has also resulted in tightening global financial markets and higher sovereign borrowing costs. Noting that most Caribbean countries are highly debt leveraged, the higher borrowing costs work against their long-term interest and investment in development projects. While Trinidad and Tobago has committed itself to a green economic transition as part of their economic diversification agenda and setting up a target for 30% reduction of 30% of electricity from renewable sources by 2030, we must be cognizant of the broader trends and indicators in the global economy that affect us all. Also, it is important to highlight that we live in a world of high uncertainty, as the impact of the COVID-19 has strongly demonstrated to all. That requires a permanent awareness to input uncertainty and different projected scenarios to manage more efficiently sudden and unexpected changes in the immediate future as well as in the long term. As we know, the world economy can be influenced by a variety of factors, including politics, trade, finance, and pandemics. Therefore, it is imperative for us to stay informed about these trends in order to make the best decision for our country's economic growth and development. Against this backdrop, today, we gather here, organized by the UN and the Central Bank, and with the collaboration of many partners, to discuss high-level overview of the current global economic conditions and how they are impacting Trinidad and Tobago. The UN office has brought together a team of experts from various fields who will be sharing their insights and knowledge with us. Our eminent speaker will share and discuss their valuable perspectives with our distinguished audience on prospective policies that can be taken to cushion these impacts. Let me briefly introduce our eminent speaker, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, Governor and Chair of the Board of Governors of Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Gregory Hill, Managing Director of ANSA Merchant Bank Limited, Dr. Vitor Gauto, Country Economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. The detailed biographies and our eminent keynote speaker has been shared with you. Please allow me to briefly run through the structure of this seminar this morning. Firstly, we will invite the keynote and featured speakers to provide their short presentation to share their perspective related to their area of expertise. And then we will move to a panel discussion session of 45 minutes, moderated by the UN office, including audience questions. So we hope that by the end of the seminar, you will leave with a better understanding of the impact of global economic conditions on Trinidad and Tobago and the policies and actions that can be taken to mitigate these impacts. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first and keynote speaker to begin his presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I want to thank the UNDP's office in Trinidad and Tobago for the initiative in putting together this wonderful seminar. I think it is quite timely, and the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago is privileged to be part of this effort. I also want to thank my wonderful team from the Central Bank, all my other presenters, and you for coming and engaging in this conversation with us today. Before I go on, for those of you who wish, you can see the presentation online. It is already on the Central Bank's website, so you could follow it then, or you could look at it afterwards at your leisure. So today, I want to just chat a bit in a conversation with you on the impact of recent external developments, as was pointed out, on Trinidad and Tobago. Well, we just came out of Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago, so let me start by painting a portrait of Trinidad and Tobago, as one of our eminent Calypsonian sniper put it. This is important because then we'll be able to set the stage and come back to them when we discuss the impact of the external developments that are still ongoing on our country. So I want to start with 4 characteristics, I think, that we want to set up, as it were. The first is that Trinidad and Tobago, unlike what some of us think, is a very small country. We only have 1.3, 1.4 million people, depending on who you count, million people. The landmass is not very, very large. And so size matters, particularly when we come to talk about competition and competitiveness and integration. The second aspect is that Trinidad and Tobago is an energy exporter. Our fortunes are tied to the energy sector. And if you look at the chart below, you will see the oil prices as they go up, our GDP, our economic output tends to move in tandem with this. This is quite important because we have the fortunes of oil, but also the flip side of it, what some may call the Dutch disease or the curse of it, because then we may not be in charge of our own fate. So this is important for us to recognize as part of the background. What that means in Trinidad and Tobago is that we tend to be very concentrated in one or two products. And this has its benefit, but as I said, it has its problems. So if you look at the chart, you would see, on the slide, you will see our GDP is the size of our GDP. And also, we tend to be classified in the richer income countries. So over 17,000 US GDP per capita classifies us and moves us away from getting some concessionary loans, etc. Government revenue to total revenue, the revenue of the energy sector is quite high for the government. And again, that determines what the fortunes of the fiscal authorities are. And our trade is also very high as a percent of GDP. So now we have a country that is small, that is well integrated, but that is focused on the energy sector. So that's point one. The second aspect, because we will get into the inflationary and financial sector aspect, is that inflation at the end of 2019 was quite small, less than 2%, and I think that's important to know. We had high inflation at one point, and you'd see the chart, it's quite stark there. The jagged line is food. Food tends to be much more volatile based on supply shocks, based on weather and all this sort of thing. Core, which excludes that, is fairly steady, but they were all rather high, and they tapered down to a starting point when the shocks happened of about 2%. This is important to know. And I'm sure you'll ask me about monetary policy. So monetary policy has been focused on indirect instruments of policy, more open market operations. The central bank is not an inflation targeter per se, but we look at everything, including the external conditions, employment, inflation, credit, and all of that. Now let's look at the banking system or the financial system. We have, as Mr. Hill will point out, a very diversified financial system, very sophisticated, I believe. It focused on the commercial banks, but you have a lot of non-banks, you have insurance companies and so forth. So this is part of the panorama, part of the starting point. But at 2019, it is characterized as very sound and healthy in terms of any of the indicators you use, whether you use capital adequacy, you use asset quality, liquidity, and profitability. So we are starting with this sort of financial and inflationary context. The third point that I want to put forward is that we had fairly substantial buffers or cushions, whatever you want to call it, or insurance policies, if you want to even call it like that, at the end of 2019. This is quite important because, as was mentioned before, you had some countries that have gone into debt distress after all the shocks. We had some things that helped us to not have to deal with all of that. What were these? Well, there were three main ones. The first, fairly high level of international reserves. Again, you look at the chart, over time when oil prices were good, money was built up at the central bank. It went to over 10 billion at one point in time. And then it started to taper off a little bit so that by the end of 2019, it was still fairly substantial at over 7 months of import cover, which is good by any metric. A little down from before, but this is where you start from. And you see the red line shows the import cover, the blue bars show the actual level of reserves. And I think that's important because in many countries, the reserves are not necessarily built up, but they are used to just, and the exchange rate and everything adjusts. In Trinidad and Tobago, the reserves were built up for a rainy day. The rainy day started even before the shocks that I'm talking about, but you will see that you started off from a fairly comfortable position. The second one is our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. What is this? This is a sovereign wealth fund where many countries around the world, they have windfalls of either it could be on the energy side, it could be coffee, it could be some other product, and they get mostly non-renewable resources, and they hive off part of these earnings again for a rainy day. In Trinidad and Tobago, it's called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And you see, it started off very slowly in the early 2000s, but it grew quite substantially. And by the end of 2019, you're talking about over $6 billion US, which is tantamount to the amount of international reserves that we have. So if you add the reserves and you have this Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which has its own rules as to how you could access it, how you deposit, and so forth, these provide them important buffers. The third aspect, and which is crucial for many countries, is on the fiscal side, that there was a fair degree of fiscal space, meaning that the debt of the country was manageable. It was not high over 60%. It went up a bit. You had external debt being quite reasonable, under 20%. And you had the fiscal deficit, although still in deficit, but not crazy like in some other territories. What that meant is that if you have a shock now, you may have some space to borrow, you may be able to maneuver a bit more. So that's the third aspect. The fourth aspect, and I think this is quite important and sometimes overlooked, is the capacity of our people. We have a creative, well-educated labor force, almost 100% literacy rate. You have, because of programs and whatever, you have people being educated formally, but also open to international training, all these courses, because Trinis get along with everybody, and we are into everything, and we want to be involved. So that characteristic means that a lot of how we key ourselves is based on the international setting. So our exposure is quite high there. And the private sector is also, because of its interrelationships with the rest of the world, also very dynamic. So not just size alone means that you are in the backwaters, but our openness, our integration with the rest of the world in education and so forth gives us a solid labor force. And if you have time, you could look at some of the charts and so forth. But at the same time, we do have some rigidities, which I think we cannot underestimate. If you look at the ease of doing business, which has its own quirks and so forth, but it still gives a picture. The World Bank's ease of doing business report, you will see in the chart below that the numbers represent our rank out of whatever amount of countries there were. In 2019, it was 190. In some earlier years, it was probably a little less. But the trajectory is not in the right direction. We seem to be getting further and further behind in terms of our competitiveness with respect to the rest of the world. And this is judged by a number of things. You'll see below the little bubbles there, starting a business, etc. And particularly for us, when you look at the details, we tended to have the most problems in registering property, construction, getting construction permits, paying taxes, believe it or not, and also international trade of goods. So the picture painted by the Ease of Doing Business report shows that we have some work to do in that. So that is the backdrop. This is the portrait I've painted just to summarize that a small, open, integrated economy biased towards the energy sector, inflation that is quite low, a financial system that is stable and diversified, a well-educated labor force, but rigidities exist, and substantial buffers on reserves, international assets in the form of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and some fiscal space. So let's go into what was pointed out before today, the shocks. What happened then? Why are we here, and what are we talking about, and what's going on? Well, we had virtually a quadruple whammy to deal with. The first is, and most dramatic, is the global pandemic. This really took all of us by surprise, and it is pervasive. I mean, I don't have to go through the gory details with you, but you see that over 6 million people died. You have it being, the confirmed cases, 758 million people. It went all around the world, the disruption to production, disruption to supply chains, everything, the disruption to people's health, social well-being, you name it. It was very graphic. We saw the images of different countries, whether it was in Peru, whether it was in New York, of all the deaths and trying to bury the dead and so forth. So this took everyone by surprise. It enveloped the whole world, and it is something that we have to deal with. The good part is that you actually saw some important international collaboration coming out of this. Like at the IMF, they suddenly introduced $160 billion in fresh currency to people. So this is, out of difficulties, you have collaboration. But this is important. This is one of the main shocks, as was pointed out before. The second one, of course, is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. And imagine we are already a year into this affair. I won't go into the details here because you probably know it already. Suffice it to say that it has gone on for a much longer time than we thought. It brought about reaction from Ukraine's allies and the world in terms of sanctions, in terms of trying to change the balance of power, as it were. And because of that, you had supply shocks that were exacerbated on the energy side, because countries are trying to kind of move Russia away from getting money to finance its operations. And so this has really impacted the energy market in a tremendous degree. And oil prices at some point, it went down on one point with the pandemic, and then they shot back up, and its volatility is the order of the day. So I will leave that for now, and you could look at that at your leisure. The third shock, and I said the quadruple whammies are interrelated, is on the inflation side. And this was on the back of supply shocks. So you had slumps in production because of the pandemic, naturally, as people closed down and so forth. And then but as demand picked up, because we have vaccination efforts, and we have to thank our scientists and healthcare professionals for helping to get us out of this thing. Demand picked up, but then it was difficult for supply to really keep pace. So therefore, you had shortages then. Of course, you had delays in reviving shipping and other transportation modes due to the pandemic, as well as we talk about the Ukraine-Russia war, which exacerbated the inflation story. And by just one measure of this is in the UK, you had inflation of reaching 40-year highs. It's quite stark, and this is replicated in many countries across the world. So the inflation one is a very serious story. Now, in response, and this is the last one of the shocks, and I say they are interrelated, you have a kind of a pendulum swing in policy. Initially, of course, you had huge fiscal support, because even the IMF was telling countries remarkably, but not remarkably because it was appropriate, but against normal fund doctrine, to spend more. you need to do this because you need to get the supplies up and so forth. So you had that huge amount of fiscal support and spending, complemented by monetary accommodation, meaning that the central banks also lower their interest rates. And if you look at the Fed chart at the top, you see the abrupt drop and the trough, as it were, in the period there. So you had a tremendous amount of monetary accommodation. But now when things started to pick up, as I talk about on the inflation side, then central banks, particularly in the larger countries, said, wait a minute, we can't, our credibility is at stake, we can't do this, let's tighten the screws now. So now you have the pendulum swinging the other way, and interest rates going up like through the roof, as it were. And if you look at the charts of some of the main countries there, you see the red arrows going up. Well, at the end of 2022, most of them were in upward mode. You had Japan, that is an outlier, and you have some other countries, but a lot of the major central banks were doing this. Now, one thing I just want to mention here is on the stock market. The stock markets internationally tended to be quite volatile. And sometimes they slumped, as you would see a part of the end 2021 going down, the trajectory is down, but also the sharpness of the movement. So that the volatility is important, because when we talk about our assets, then that comes into play. So volatility in stock markets. So just to summarize, I mentioned having painted the 4 points of our portrait. Now we have a shock with let me go backwards. We have the response to central banks, inflation, Ukraine, and of course, the pandemic. So let me move swiftly into what were the reactions of Trinidad and Tobago. The first thing is on the output side, the fiscal side, and the balance of payments. Well, naturally, output tanked, because if you look at what has happened to us, you'll see up to the deaths here are 4,336. Well, the latest numbers is 4,347 on the Ministry of Health, which is from Tuesday. So there's a lot of deaths for a small country. Vaccination efforts have taken hold, and I think you are getting the benefit of that. But we had, as you see, lockdowns, we had restrictions on movement, we had curfew, we had everything that was necessary in this dire situation, and that necessarily led to a real sharp decline in output. So that's one thing we have to bear in mind. Some people say God is a Trini, but I don't know. But the fact is that energy prices went up because of the factors that I told you, and since I painted that the reserves and the fiscal have a dependence on energy, we find that the fiscal balance was not fully affected. We'll get to that. But the lower chart shows that the value of our energy exports, of our total exports, actually went up at some point in time. So there was a flip side to it. Let's go on to the inflation scenario. On the chart below, you would see, I think the blue line is on the inflation one. So inflation remember I started off with under 2%. Well, we went up after that, and now in December, we're up to 8.7%, which is relatively high. What was this due to? Mainly in the central bank's analysis, due to external factors because of our open economy. We also had the reduction in the subsidy on petroleum, which affected quite a few products. But to a large extent, it was externally generated. The central bank initially dropped the reserve requirement, and we dropped the repo rate, so in other words, interest rates. This freed up a lot of liquidity, and it's provided the wherewithal for the business revival, credit to business to revive. And you see that in the green line there. For quite a while, it was actually in negative territory year on year, but this has picked up. Some may ask, well, why is the central bank not raising interest rates like that? Well, we look at things very carefully at the bank. We are aware of the inflation dynamics. We are aware of our interest differentials with the rest of the world are turning adverse, but we are also aware that the economy is still in a fledgling state of recovery, So at this time, we have not yet raised interest rates, but we are open to reviewing the data. On the financial side, we have the banks, the insurance companies, the other non-banks providing payment deferrals and rate reductions and so forth for their clients. The central bank supported this, so allowed some of this to foster, but luckily we didn't have to kind of keep it on forever. There was a kind of rollback to that over time. And the fact is that asset quality has not deteriorated substantially. If you look at the ratio of non-performing loans to total loans, it's just about 3.2% compared to 2.9% prior to the end of 2019. And other indicators of health are fairly robust: capital adequacy, profitability, etc. Let me go on to the last couple things. The buffers. The buffers were important. As the picture I painted, well, you have a buffer. You run into somebody, well, you're glad you have the buffer because now it prevents you from getting hurt. So the buffers did their job to some extent. We had international reserves. We had some decline in international reserves, but not much, and they're still fairly healthy now. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund in the middle part, that was tapped, so over 1.6 billion was utilized, was drawn from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to support fiscal activity, to support disadvantaged groups, vaccinations, health system, etc. But at the end of, later on, there were actually deposits into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund because oil prices had gone back up. Remember I was talking about the stock market volatility? Well, here's where it comes in. Because the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is invested in assets abroad, and when the value of these assets change, then the value of our HSF is altered. And it was not unusual for in one day the value to go up or down by $30–40 million because of the volatility. So it's something we have to be very aware of. We can't panic because you're really supposed to invest for the long term, but it is something that would exercise our minds. Very quickly on the fiscal side, there were a number of offsetting factors. On the one hand, revenue was suppressed naturally because of less activity. Then you have expenditure going up because of the support programs, health, and so forth. But of course, we had the other side where, because of the energy prices going up, that helped to mute the fiscal balance effect of it. And so that we ended up with debt that was not explosive compared to other countries where they are in serious debt distress. Let me go on to the last factor, I'm conscious of the time now. The fourth aspect I talked about our creative population, I talked about the rigidities and so forth. Well, somewhat surprising to me in terms of the magnitude of it is that we seem to have experienced a tremendous increase in labor productivity over the pandemic. If you look at the green line, it measures labor productivity, a measure of output and a measure of hours worked on the denominator. And what that shows, even if you can't believe the exact numbers, is that productivity of the labor employed had increased. And it is not actually that surprising, because you had people being able to do more with less, as it were. You had efficiency gains, and with either less people, so employment may have been less, but output may have continued, or less hours worked, less overtime, and so forth. And we also have an improvement, I think, and Mr. Hill may talk about that, on the way of doing business. People embraced new product offerings, greater deals, digital payment methods, and all this sort of things. But at the end of it all, I think we still have some work to do, and probably some serious work to do, because local and foreign potential investors still report that it is tricky to get things done in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have to watch that very carefully, whether it's opening a business, getting a location, accessing finance, dealing with day-to-day operations and operating in a secure business environment. So just to summarize that part of it now, we have the responses basically that we had a decline in output, but a mixed picture on the fiscal side and on the balance of payment side. We have labor productivity growing. We have rigidities still there. We have the buffers that are doing their job. They're still there, but they're less than before. And we have inflation taking an upward path, and fiscal and monetary policy accommodating, and the financial sector also being supported. So all right, so let me conclude by giving 3 lessons that we think are important to bear in mind. First of all, overall, we think there's good room for optimism for Trinidad and Tobago in the wake of recent and ongoing external shocks. We have and continuing to weather the storm because we are not out of the woods yet. But global inflation, we believe, is tapering off, partly because potentially of the success of tight monetary policies in other countries, and the supply problems are being worked out. But we have some countries that are facing pandemic-induced debt distress. So we have to be aware that something could come, right? But we have not experienced that to a large extent. Domestic inflation at the central bank, we believe that it will still tick up over the next couple of months, but we believe in line with international developments, it should taper off later on. The buffers help to reduce the problems that we face and to provide much needed financing without a buildup of debt. But we have to be careful because we should not allow this to postpone reforms, structural reforms. Sometimes when you have money, you say, well, I don't need to change. Well, because why do I need to change? Well, we have to be careful. We have to continue our structural reforms to make our society more productive. The second lesson, new opportunities arise, but potentially deep scars need to be addressed. What are these new opportunities? Well, it is fair to say that a lot of things will not be the same. You've gone to using your ATM card, using less cash, transferring money to your gardener via online transfers. You're not going back. You online meetings and so forth. So some of these things will be permanent. Digitization and fintech solutions are advancing, so I think that's a strong sign that we're heading up there. And we even have 4 companies that are already authorized to issue electronic money in Trinidad and Tobago. So these are some new opportunities that would arise apart from the ones that I talked about. But I won't spend much time on this, but the scars are important to be aware of. The first one is on education, because children were not able to go to school for a period of time, and this affected not only them, but it will affect future generations, their earning capacity, the social interaction, and so forth. And a study in the US, the McKinsey group found that grades K to 12, which I think is close to our pre-tertiary education, they were 5 months behind in learning math and 4 months in learning English. So, and the scars could end up pervading over time. And it's not just the learning there, but their social isolation, the fact that they may have lost family members. You had glitchy internet connections, you had Zoom fatigue, all of this affected children, and this could continue into the future. The other scar is that inequality may have actually increased because, guess what? The most affected from the pandemic tended to be the disadvantaged. The more prosperous may have had ability to hedge, but the lower income, fixed income people may have had more problems with their health. They may have postponed insurance. They may not have insurance, and then They may have postponed even checkups. So even if the pandemic didn't catch them, but the other diseases that may have suffered from, they could not support that. So in most countries, fiscal support helped to redress some of this, but it is something to be aware of. In Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, we don't have the data. In the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a study that showed that some of the impact could be quite permanent on inequality. We look forward to our survey of living conditions in Trinidad and Tobago by the CSO. That might give policymakers some good information. The last point I want to make here is that a focused, no-nonsense approach is needed to move domestic service delivery to international standards. Well, I mentioned a whole set of shocks, the 4 shocks, but most countries in the world were affected by this, or all countries, maybe more or less. So everybody's trying to get out of it. Everybody's doing their best. We weren't unique. It didn't just happen to us, and some are actually doing quite well. The world is becoming a much more not dramatically, I should say, but difficult place to do business because people are more competitive. There's a vicious fight for market share because countries realize the problems that they were faced with in the pandemic. They don't want to get back to that. Governments don't want to get back to that also. The consumer also has changed. They become more footloose. They don't have loyalty to this brand or that brand, whatever is the best deal in commodity markets, in energy, in tourism. They will just move. They don't like Tobago, well, they go to Cancun, they go to Zagreb or wherever. So you have to be alert. You have to get your service standards up. So in such a world, Trinidad and Tobago will have to quickly and purposefully move so as not to be left behind. I think it is a race that we are in, and I think we have to be serious. We have to make sure that we get our act together so that we're able to, as a small developing country, that we find our place in this world. For those of you from Trinidad and Tobago, you will no doubt know David Rudder, and he sang an iconic song called Dust in the Face. Well, I think the real question is, what side of the dust will we be on? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor, for that really wonderful presentation. I think I'm not an economist, but I understood it all. Thank you so much. I will now move on in the program to invite Mr. Gregory Hill, the General Manager, the Managing Director, of Answer Merchant Bank, to give his presentation from the perspective of the private sector. Mr. Hill.
Good morning, all. Thank you for that nice introduction, Mr. Noto. I would first like to recognize my fellow panelists, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Alvin Hilaire. What an excellent presentation this morning. Would you all agree? Dr. Victor Gauto, Country Economist, IDB. Good morning. And to thank AmCham for asking me to participate today. All protocols observed. Distinguished invitees and attendees and the public who may be joining us online. I'm delighted to be in this esteemed company to have a discussion on the impact of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and all the associated impacts on Trinidad and Tobago. My perspective is a little bit different, and it's coming from the private sector. And the good news, it's an optimistic one. Governor, thanks again for your valuable contribution. Today, we all are much better off from the data you presented today. It gives us a very good context for what I will say today. And based on the data from the central bank and international rankings, let us presence where we are. Let's do a quick situation analysis. The following slides I will share with you very quickly looking at the TT inflation rate, as the governor shared earlier, the correlation between food prices in TNT and rising oil and wheat prices, a significant increase in the retail price index, the pace of decline in net official reserves slowed. This was very good news. And the governor noted that earlier in his presentation. And as we both may agree, the governor and myself, some say God is a Trini. The boost in energy revenue in 2021 to 2022, well, the data kind of supports that. So if you all wanted evidence that he has a national flag, it's in the data. And this is how we really benefited, indirectly from the commodities bubble. Consider our total revenue for the 2 years of the pandemic and post-pandemic. Look at it carefully. Now look at the performance of our labor force in the non-energy sector. Just 6% of revenue of the petroleum energy sector. This slide just shows our slow economic growth, actually negative 3% compared to others in the world, 196 countries. That's where we're coming from as a country, and this is just statistics based. The question is, where do we want to go as a country? Well, to do that, let's look at where the rest of the world is going. Global interest rates and inflation. Developed markets will increase monetary policy rates to tackle inflation. Emerging markets, like us, are more accustomed to high interest rates and will survive, as we have more flexibility in defending our currencies and being a little bit more nimble. Near to midterm, the inflation picture is uncertain due to new policy measures that have been implemented very recently, global warming, and China's reopening post-COVID, which is going to be significant. Short-term inflation rates, we feel, will persist due to the reduction in the purchase of gas from Russia and its reduced supply to Europe. However, longer-term inflation, technology, and an aging global population places a lid on inflation in the long run based on current trends. Now for a few local considerations. We are a fundamental importer of inflation, given the realities of being an island. We can't help that. Small island nations are challenged by external shocks due to their inability to influence demand. As such, monetary policy is a key tool for dealing with food and fuel inflation. Surging energy commodity prices benefited Trinidad and Tobago, especially seen in fertilizers. Russia and Ukraine accounted for 15 to 20% of global fertilizer exports, and TNT has benefited as a result. The non-energy sector remained resilient, though, during COVID-19. We have a strong banking sector and high-quality external investments, as presented by the governor earlier. COVID-19 winners. Global growth is projected to fall from an estimated 3.4% in 2002 to 2.9% in 2023, but then rise again to 3.1% in 2024. And who are the winners? Well, corporations that invested in supply chains 2 years ago, especially compared to their competitors, will do very well. Companies that invested in automation and digitization, digital transformation, will see a lot less high costs in their P&L going forward. Tech companies, especially in the software space, did really well. And of course, emerging green industries, especially on the energy production side. However, the future can be very bright. We are an island, yes, part of CARICOM, which is part of the wider Americas, which is part of the global economy. So we need to look at what's happening globally. And globally, we are seeing shifts in a particular direction. We are seeing major shifts in energy transformation. We are seeing digitization. We are seeing open AI infrastructure and architecture. We see changes in the medical industry, how people work, how they communicate, how they advertise, how they run their businesses. The old formulae are changing ever so rapidly. Then there's a change in terms of pure capitalism versus more equality, versus more sustainability, and more purpose in business and in life is moving to the front. These dynamics are coming together into a new cocktail that has not yet been prescribed as yet. So we need to figure out this cocktail, which is headed directly in our direction. We do want to position ourselves inside of it. How do we prepare for it and line up our resources and strategies as a country to move forward using the benefits and great talents that we have as Trinbagonians? Considering the central bank data, points I've just shared with you, and the changes that you know have taken place and are taking place, here are some of the opportunities for us to consider. I did promise I was going to be optimistic from the private sector. This is not necessarily the formula, but it's one of the many paths we can take as a country. The important thing for us, we need to know that there are paths, there are options, and we need to decide collectively which one or ones that we want to follow and what journey we want to be on, and then deliberately go in those directions. I will begin with the elephant in the room, the oil and gas industry. Middle Eastern countries are well on their way to choosing not one path, but many new paths. So we have the UAE transitioning and changing their economy rapidly. Now they're looking at pivoting into education, innovation, and fintech, and making rapid changes in this direction. Let's consider Dubai and tourism. Burj Khalifa, tallest building in the world. I'm sure some of you have been to visit it already. Deep Dive Dubai, the deepest man-made diving pool. Neom, also known as The Line, the longest horizontal, hyper-connected development of communities, 170 kilometers long. Anything that the UAE can do to attract attention, higher, lower, bigger, longer, they're going to do it just to get your attention. And these investments attract a lot of tourism dollars as they transition their economy. You know, the rest of the Caribbean diversified away from sugar many, many years ago into tourism. Trinidad and Tobago didn't do that because we had oil and gas, of course. And we all know and should recognize now that oil and gas in the long term, as currently structured, is not a place that we need to be over-reliant on. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. Perhaps we now decide to go into tourism, join the Caribbean tourism market. So the question is, we have the resources now to pivot into something like tourism, or maybe not. Should we invest in being the best tourism destination in the Caribbean now? Or should we build the infrastructure and run the tourism product for the Caribbean? Should we lead in airlift, sea transportation, cruise and cargo, shipping, logistics, and tourism booking, digital technology systems? Is that our best fit? Do we have the energy, the logistic skills, financial reserves, technology background to pivot now to become the Amazon, the top airline, best cruise home port of the entire Caribbean? Should we do that? Should we do something else? Should we do a few other things? I think the governor's message was very somber in notifying that we need to start making room for change. Do we want to look at other sectors? Digitization, AI, Should we be teaming up with multinational tech companies to set up offices right here to prevent the brain drain by having people upskill in those areas right now, today? Trinbagonians with jobs with university education stand at 22%. How many of these people were assigned to the energy sector? Where are they now? Given the job cuts in the energy sector over the last few years, the brain drain may be an even larger issue facing Trinidad and Tobago over the next few years, with skilled persons fleeing to countries that would best utilize their skill set. We saw this before. What can we do now to transition our education systems? The ex-oil and gas staff are now getting skilled in digitization and green energy, battery storage, energy transmission, and the like. We should support our education system into a transformation into these areas from now. Why wait? We all must start to transform the skill sets so that we have a future-fit economy. Future fit, not presently fit, future fit, designed to deal with long-term issues like climate change and the technology revolution. Right now, our income comes from Wall Street, global commodity prices. We really have no impact on them. But yet the people are the ones that are left behind when the market falls and there are resulting cutbacks on jobs. And even our own GDP is impacted. Let's face facts. We're a price and market taker. Just to go back to the tourism example, in other countries, other islands in the Caribbean, multiple levels of society participate in the tourism product. And the tourism product permeates the entire economy, and everyone participates, from the taxi driver down to the coconut vendor. Our economy is not structured like that. The so-called man in the street does not play a role in driving the key engines of our economy. So we need to find a way to transition to Main Street from the economic overdependence on Wall Street. It's something to think about. And what do I mean about Main Street? What do I mean about transition out of Wall Street? Well, history was focused on capitalism on Wall Street. Now we need to get Wall Street to be a little more like Main Street also, to engage with a wider stakeholder group, a larger amount of participants. And we need to be sensitive to the inequalities. We saw this become a major issue during the pandemic. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are our guide as to how we can bring everyone along in a more inclusive way in the future. As we pivot our economy, we must bring everyone on board, not just the elite or upper end of this economic and educational strata. We must bring everybody along. Let's speak a little bit about the financial sector, an area of comfort for me. As a banker, I see lots of opportunities. Capital markets development. There was a time that we were moving significant capital across the Caribbean. That slowed post-2008 crisis. Never really recovered to where it was before. And we were heading in a great direction, Trinidad being the center of capital markets. Seeing a lot of opportunity in private equity investments to formalize and mobilize private family capital and private business capital into transitioning the country. We need to look at the rules and regulations behind investment of insurance funds. Are they best utilized the way they are now? Many of them are invested globally, and their local investments are quite limited. We need to look at that closer. The multinational and multilateral and regional development banks, they need to all come together with us and help us transition our economy with new products and services to help us deal with this transition. The risks are uncertain. The future is now being shaped. We need more unique products from these organizations to help us pivot and manage that transition together. This requires more risk assessment, collaboration, and risk sharing as we all enter the future. Many of the biggest investors in the world, like BlackRock and Vanguard, they are already investing in smart grids, biofuel, and climate technology generally. These areas are going to be a US multi-trillion economy. And yes, that's a T, trillion. Wouldn't we want to be part of that? So we have to decide now, what part of that multi-trillion-dollar economy do we want to play in? Our national budget compared to this is a tiny fraction of same. We could certainly fit in there and do well and prosper, and our people prosper as well. So here's a thought. Let's all enroll the oil and gas companies that operate in the country today. They have already committed to transition their economic models by 2050 to more energy-related and a little bit less oil and gas only. They made that commitment publicly, globally. They've committed to 50% diversification of their model by 2050. Why don't we ask them as an important stakeholder group to start diversifying their focus with Trinidad and Tobago? Why not start here first? They have been present in Trinidad and Tobago for over 100 years. Should they not only pivot elsewhere, but here also, and work as a collaborative stakeholder in transitioning us to the new energy? This is where the demand is going to come from in the future. And the profits too. This is not a charity, ladies and gentlemen. This is not a charity. This is where future profitability is going to come from. And they understand profits, and they have shareholders. So let's transition with them. And therefore, if they are pivoting from oil and gas business into the energy business, then let's make the change here with us. At Answer Merchant Bank and Answer Bank, we've demonstrated our commitment to this transition with the launch of our Natural Capital Hub to foster innovation and investments in the green economy. And every day we're getting new partners joining us on that journey. I leave you one last point to consider. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a creativity and a culture which is second to none. How can we use that creativity to influence and drive future innovation in our economy? In the future, basic jobs will be done by AI and robotics. Let's face facts. So if we work like robots in the future, these jobs will be replaced by machines. And we will lose our space in the economic cycle. However, creativity is what will separate us from everyone else. The human creativity in Trinbagonians gives us a huge head start to building the skill set, fueled by our inherent optimism to pick our path or paths into the future. Let's harness that skill set. Having just come out of the mother of all carnival seasons, the crucible of creativity in all arenas, I urge you, let's start chipping along this new direction together. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill, for that presentation on the perspective from the private sector. Bonus points for the Blade Runner reference in your presentation. I will now invite Victor Gauto from the Inter-American Development Bank to give his perspective from the international development community.
Dr. Hilaire, Mr. Noto, Mr. Hill, Mr. Prasad, distinguished members of the audience, good morning. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I'd like to thank the UN Residence Office for your kind invitation for being here today. Undoubtedly, these have been very challenging times, as we have heard from the presentations we've seen. As we can see in the chart on the left-hand side, 2020 was one of the most difficult years in recent history, where many of our countries endured a negative economic shock that was the largest of any over the last 20 years. Since then, if we look at the right-hand side, GDP growth in our economies has struggled, and the geopolitical context has driven increases in energy prices, contributing to increasing inflation rates around the world. These high energy prices have affected our economies differently, since energy exporters in our region have been able to have moderate recoveries since the pandemic and have strengthened their fiscal positions. But other economies in our region, especially the tourism-dependent economies, have had greater challenges in recovering. We see on the chart on the right-hand side the IMF's projections for GDP growth for Trinidad and Tobago. And you can see the changing perspectives a little bit between the estimates that were produced in April and the estimates that were produced in October, where the perspectives have become more optimistic, and average GDP growth for Trinidad and Tobago increased from 1.9% per year to 2.5% per year for the years between 2023 and 2027. Giving a signal of the size of the moderate recovery. However, increasing price levels have affected everyone. And I wanted to show this chart that is part of the research that we produced in our annual macro report at the IDB that shows the impact on poverty of a 20% increase in the prices of food. So this is we heard the governor talk about increasing inequality in the region, and this is our take on the potential impacts and estimates on how those increases in food prices could affect the different countries and poverty levels. A 20% increase in food prices could lead to a 2.3% increase in poverty and a 2.5% increase in extreme poverty, which means millions of people would go into poverty, threatening household food security and increasing inequality across the region. As you can see, a lot of our IDB member countries in Latin America are the most exposed to these challenges, with Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico at the top of this chart, and with our Caribbean member countries closer to the bottom of the chart. The research suggests that a transfer of 0.5 percentage point of GDP would be necessary in the region as a whole to move these households that would fall into poverty back out of poverty. So these increases pressures on public finances to the extent the inflation rates, especially on food prices, are high or keep increasing. So what has the bank done, the IDB, done to support the region in this difficult and challenging time during the pandemic and now in the context of high energy prices and inflation rates? Well, in terms of how the bank has supported the region, I'd like to frame my remarks within the priorities the bank has identified as key areas of support in Latin America and the Caribbean. And these key areas of support that the bank is proposing for the region are, first, social issues, such as the reduction of poverty and inequality, health, and food security. So that's at the very forefront of the bank's priorities in this context. Climate change adaptation and mitigation is also at the center of our list of priorities to support the region and governments. And finally, physical and digital infrastructure supporting regional integration. And I'll come back to this in a moment a bit later. But these are all important areas of IDB support as the region navigates the current global conditions. These priorities suggest that the IDB supports renewable energy products, developing climate-resilient infrastructure, developing human capital, and supporting vulnerable populations also. As you can see, in terms of regional policies in the Caribbean, these priorities align well, for example, with CARICOM's Vision 2025 by 2025, which has the objective of strengthening food security in the Caribbean by reducing food imports by 25% by 2025, among other policy objectives. So how did the IDB support countries during the pandemic? Well, it issued record-level approvals in terms of new loans to countries in the region, reaching over $20 billion in lending to both governments and the private sector in 2020, including $1 billion for vaccine acquisition and distribution. Additionally, we had to adjust also our lending instruments and accelerated our procedures, striving to get support to our countries when they needed it the most. In terms of our Caribbean countries, or Caribbean member countries, which are Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Suriname, and Barbados, loans to governments during this period increased significantly from $305 million in 2019 to $921 million in 2020. We've also reached higher levels of approvals in 2022, reaching almost $1.2 billion. So these are loans supporting the countries navigate the pandemic and accelerate the recovery. The objectives of the loans varied from supporting vulnerable populations and cash transfer programs to supporting the health sector with materials, equipment, and infrastructure, as well as financing supporting the recovery of small and medium enterprises. So support was very broad and extensive. Other loans were intended to strengthen fiscal frameworks and provide budget support as part of government COVID response plans. Specific to Trinidad and Tobago, in 2020, we approved loans for $150 million, and one loan for $100 million directly supported the government's pandemic response policies. The specific objectives of that program were to promote the availability and timely execution of financial and material resources to respond to the effects of the health crisis caused by COVID, and to strengthen the counter-cyclical effect of fiscal policies through the temporary introduction of measures to protect income of vulnerable households and increase liquidity and support for businesses during the health and economic crisis, as well as promoting economic and fiscal recovery in the post-pandemic. But I'd like to highlight that our partnership with Trinidad and Tobago is not limited to loans, but it also includes a large technical cooperation portfolio, which is non-reimbursable support, right? And the areas that these TCs cover are of key interest to the government and the private sector. They support capacity building, and they support also knowledge generation. And since 2020, the IDB's portfolio of TCs or technical cooperations in Trinidad and Tobago is more than $13 million, and they're in wide areas, supporting areas and improving productivity in transportation, water and sanitation, and private sector development. For example, supporting the preparation of the public-private partnership project for port infrastructure is something that we supported last year. We also have plans to support the design of a high-quality, blue carbon credit scheme in Tobago, which aims to improve the digital mapping, monitoring, and reporting and verification of ecosystem services, which supporting environmental sustainability and supporting also climate adaptation and mitigation. The bank priorities are all necessary areas of development to support the region navigate current global conditions, supporting policies boosting productivity, the business climate, addressing social challenges, will contribute to supporting economic activity and protect the livelihood of millions that are currently vulnerable. And I'd like to end on a point that we've heard repeatedly through the presentations, which is digitization and its significance, and stress that our current country strategy in partnership with the government of Trinidad and Tobago is focused on a single pillar of digital transformation. So digital transformation is expected to spearhead economic development and diversification. In the public sector, digitalization could contribute to better government services and strengthening the business climate. In the private sector, there are several areas of potential positive spillovers in digitalization. We heard Mr. Hill name several sectors, but such sectors such as software development, cybersecurity services, financial services, transportation, logistics and tourism would all contribute to opening up the economy to new global opportunities and leverage that highly educated workforce that we heard about in both presentations earlier. So those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gauto. So I'll now invite, just to let you know, of course, we're running a little bit behind. I beg your indulgence for us to proceed until 12:30. So I'll invite the panelists to join us on stage. Governor of the Central Bank, Mr. Hill, and Mr. Gauto, if you can join us. And then we will start with questions from the floor, because you've all been very patiently waiting to ask your questions. We will begin with questions on the floor and questions that are being submitted virtually by our online participants. Thank you.
Mr. Hill, you can take the middle seat. Okay, sure. Governor here. Pick down the edge. Yeah. Thank you.
Put me in the center.
Thank you. We have cut short sort of the discussion directly to the audience question, and we will invite audience to ask the questions. But if you can keep it to between 1 or 2 questions and keep it short so that and clear so that our panelists can respond accordingly. We will start off with the audience question. If there's any audience questions or any live stream questions, so we can go and start with that one. Yes, we have the lady there. Can we have the mic, please?
Good morning, Lara Quentrell Thomas, Regency Recruitment and Resources Limited. A couple of comments and then a question. First, a bit disappointed there are no women on the panel. Secondly, I want to challenge the central bank governor's statistic about our literacy rate being at 99%. Anybody who works in Trinidad and Tobago knows that that figure is totally wrong. We are probably closer to 60 in terms of functional literacy. So I just wanted to challenge that. But I have 2 questions related to the ease of doing business, because we all know that in Trinidad and Tobago, it's pretty horrendous at the minute. What can we do in the private sector to make it easier? 2 things. 1, access foreign exchange, and 2, open a bank account. Just those 2 simple things that we struggle with daily. The public sector has not evolved in the way that we would like it to with digital transformation and so on, but we are in the private sector, and yet the bureaucracy keeps us back. So what can we do to further our agenda in terms of those 2 issues for me, and sort of more generally the ease of doing business? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? So we can collate 2 or 3 questions before we actually ask the panelists to respond. Any questions from the online stream? No? Okay. Maybe I'll go with the governor first, and then also ask Mr. Gregory Hill to also respond. Sure. Let's start with governor.
Yes, thanks very much for your question. With respect to the statistics, we got it directly from the Central Statistical Office. But I see what you're probably saying, that you have to dig deeper into the 99%, and then you may find other things so I appreciate that. But as the statistics that we have, and they may be just counting, well, how many people could read and write and so forth. But if you are looking for a deeper metric, then I appreciate what you're saying. With respect to the private sector, I think I got 2 questions, one on foreign currency and on the ease of doing business. With respect to the foreign currency, we all know that we are in a situation now in Trinidad and Tobago where the market is not clearing. And so we do have some access problems. And I think in the short run, I think as a society, it is important that we have a consistent, how should I put it, foreign exchange regime that involves better access and that involves more equitable access. So I do agree with you. But we are in a transition point, and I think for the most part, for the short run, and it may not be that satisfying, you may need to continue to work with your institutions to access the foreign exchange. And then as a society, once we have developed a proper macroeconomic situation, then the ease of access may become better as the market clears. With respect to the ease of doing business, what can the private sector do? I think the private sector should do a couple of things. One is to show that you can take advantage of the ease of doing business. When you see like Tribe and you see the other bands and you see, wait a minute, how nimble, how dynamic, how world-class the things are going, then you say, all right, well, these guys deserve to have easier access and easier ways of doing everything. I think the other aspect is continued lobbying and making sure that your voice is heard in whatever forum, whether it is this one or in others, because the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And if it is imperative because policymakers see that this thing needs to be done, then it will be done. But if there is a complacency and, well, let's go along with it, it won't happen. So these are my thoughts on this matter. I think you had raised something before, but I didn't, in the preliminary. The lack of what? Yeah, I think that actually tried to get, anyway, let me not get into that.
I'll respond to that. I think we did invite a few women economists as well as from the multilateral development institutions to be part of it. But unfortunately, they were unavailable at this point in time. But we take your point on board, and it is something that we are also trying to work on in our future seminars that we will be organizing. But just moving on to your question on a different angle, Gregory, in terms of access to finance and cost of doing business, you mentioned about the way to transition to a new greener economy, as well as looking at how we can work smarter, and you talked about AI and other whole host of business. How do you think the private sector can adapt in the long term in trying to adapt to this changing global environment? Okay,
thank you for that question. I'd first like to complete one of the questions that was asked about the ease of doing business to open bank accounts. As a banker, I say that I hear you. I appreciate the challenge that you've had, and we plan to take that on. Naturally, you have to ensure that your financial system is stable and sound, and it's been demonstrated that way. The rigors of paperwork were created to manage anti-money laundering and ensuring that identities are correlated to correct personalities operating bank accounts. So, time has changed, technology has evolved, and we hear you, we take on that challenge. Certainly from our perspective and our financial institution, we will be coming with new state-of-the-art technology that will enable opening bank accounts a lot easier while maintaining the robustness of the compliance process and working with our partners at the central bank to do so. So change is coming. So just give us a little bit more time and stay tuned. With respect to the second question, from a financing perspective, how can the private sector transition? In Barbados, 50% of my loan growth in our bank in Barbados is in solar energy, electric vehicles. The business society has transformed towards the strong commitment to go green in Barbados. And so our lending practices have morphed to accommodate facilitating financing the green energy sector. In Trinidad and Tobago, we are looking at our underwriting policies and guidelines to build in an inherent understanding of how do we finance the transition economy. We are, through our natural capital hub, recruiting expertise in the green economy, which will help us to adjudicate risk in a better way, help us to recognize the impact of who we lend to in that transition economy and who we don't want to lend to in the future. We plan to be very transparent about that, report on it, and through our hub plan to make access to capital through our global partners, a lot of sovereigns have approached us to join our hub, to direct capital from the more developed markets that are ahead of the green transition into the Caribbean, into Trinidad and Tobago, and play our role in the transition. So I would say the private sector, there's a lot of opportunity for the future, and there will be a lot of financing capability. What you need is scale, technology, and like Tribe Band, perform at the world class. When you come with your financing proposals, make sure it's at a global standard so that you can transition us as a country at the highest level.
Thank you.
Perhaps I could
Please.
comment on the question. Forgive me, I forgot about the bank accounts. We take that very seriously at the central bank because we think financial inclusion is important for people at all levels to be able to access formal financing. Because other than that, you will get into something that could be risky. You hoard all your cash, or you get into some risky area to either finance your activities or to deposit your funds. So we think that's important. We are working with the banks. Some months ago, we issued something called simplified due diligence to the banks for less onerous requirements for individuals and for small businesses. So they are taking that on board. We are dialoguing with them because there is, as was mentioned, a balance between quality of the customers and making sure that they're not into money laundering or so, but you could go overboard. And so we are continuing to work with them, and we take it very seriously. We have our, our National Financial Literacy Program. We have our Office of the Financial Services Ombudsman, and we are beefing up this year the move towards financial inclusion, either via more education, a greater redress via the Office of the Financial Services officer, or market conduct, where we talk to the banks and make sure that things are well. But it is a priority for us, and we continue to dialogue with our licensees to move this along.
Thank you, Governor. Victor, if I can pull you in here and talk about, you talked about the TA component as well as the loans. How can IDB actually support the agenda of private sector development and ease of doing business through an IDB loan programs or TA component? You mentioned some of them. If you can elaborate a bit more on that and look at how it can be more relevant to Trinidad.
Yeah, I mean, the TC programs generally respond to specific requests from the government or private sector, right? And as different stakeholders identify a need that they want to strengthen or develop, we're available to support that, leverage the resources of the bank to develop those capacities for private sector development, right? I mentioned one example during the remarks, which is the development of the request for proposals for the port infrastructure project, right? But like that, we're also participating in supporting specifically digitization projects across stakeholders, and being actively engaged in looking at where the stakeholders identify needs for us, and develop and participate with them in partnerships to address those challenges.
Thank you, Victor. Is there any further question from the floor? Anyone would like to make any interventions?
What? I didn't hear.
No, she mentioned that she had called the central bank in relation
and
the office.
Financial ombudsman, and they both said not their business to deal with bank accounts last year.
You mean to open bank accounts?
Problems I was having opening a bank account.
Oh yes, technically speaking, they may tell you that because no, that's the well, yes, because the financial services ombudsman, their remit or his remit is to look at problems someone who already has an account is getting, problems that they have. Then they talk to the financial institution, they try to work out something. And then if you call the supervision department, they also may say that. So it may fall through the cracks like that, but it is a priority, certainly a priority for me and for the institution. It may not be fit in a nice space, and that is why we are actually reforming the way we do things so that will be more pervasive. So you will still get that reply, but I can assure you that we will continue to work on it, but we really appreciate the feedback. And then feel free to, we have info@central-bank.org. You could get the thing, send it to us, and all of that will be part of our dialogue with the financial institutions. So it may not fall into the category of some officer, but it will pervade our whole approach to dealing with this important issue.
Thank you, Governor. Maybe I will move forward and look at some of the specific issues you raised in your presentation, and we'll also have some of the issues that were also raised by Gregory and also Victor in the presentation. One of them is looking at long-term economic growth and dealing with long-term inflationary expectations. If we have to outline two policy issues or two particular structural issues that we have to look at immediately and in the long term, what that would be. So maybe we could start with Mr. Gregory from a private sector point of view, and then we can move on to the governor and then Victor from a regional perspective.
Okay. Long-term inflationary pressure, to manage that on the long term, of course, the long term depends on the time scale. Cost reduction through digitization and automation certainly is going to play a role in bringing down the current cost structure of doing business. And the greater investment today in automation and efficiencies will change the cost structure of future businesses. I think that to implement those measures, one has to invest today in artificial intelligence, into machine learning. You have to make the significant investments now, which are the top of the curve in terms of prices. It could be fairly costly in terms of technology. But over the long term, these investments today will lower the long-term cost impact of doing business, of executing certain types of transactions. We're seeing robo-investing taking place now. A lot of the large global investors relying on AI technology, how to allocate capital, how to allocate investments. This work was done in the past by individual analysts. Now it's being handled by machines. So I think that their cost structure for that type of work has now been reduced significantly because it's done by technology. Now, those investments started a long time ago, right? So to deal with long-term inflation, one has to look at finding the cost drivers and implementing the right technologies now to be able to do that. And of course, inflation is driven by supply and demand, of course. So it's either you increase the supply of your core elements of what we think is the future business, and also manage demand also from that perspective. And there will be equilibrium. I mentioned that with an aging population and technology, long-term inflation, we expect it to smoothen out. But due to the post-pandemic growth in demand, due to the shortages of energy and commodity bubble, short-term price inflation is something for us that we have to deal with right now. And of course, the central banks around the world are using various measures of monetary policy in terms of managing interest rates to be able to deal with short-term inflation. I'll leave that for the governor to add a little bit more color from a local context.
Thank you, Gregory. Governor, you mentioned a few things in terms of the long-term structural changes that are required. If you can elaborate a bit more on that, and what can be done to rein in long-term inflationary expectations that you also mentioned in your long-term inflationary expectations.
Yes. Okay. Let me complement what has been said now on the supply-demand imbalance, and I think I take the point very seriously that ultimately inflation to some extent is dependent on the gap between demand and supply, as we saw during the pandemic when demand went up but supply was sluggish. And so what was discussed, I think, is quite important to get technology on your side to be able to boost demand and to also have demand flexible, because supply will be going up and down, and you want demand demand will be going up and down, so you want to have supply being nimble and being able to do that. And here's where the rigidities come in. In some countries, for example, in Asia, and a lot of Asian countries, if there is, let's talk about a big price, which is the exchange rate. If they depreciate their currency a little, well, toys fly off the shelves. People move from one space to the other very quickly to take advantage of a price benefit from an exchange rate change. I'm just using that example. In Trinidad and Tobago and a lot of countries, even in Latin America, there are so many rigidities that it takes a long while for labor to move, for capital to move, for business processes to adapt. So I think the technology side would help, and the sensitivity and the ease of doing business would help to get rigidities out. But let me go over to the macroeconomic side, because as some economists say, and those who study economics, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. So ultimately, you must have proper macroeconomic policy and proper coordination among the fiscal side, which is the government buying and selling goods and services and taxing and so forth, the monetary, which is the central bank and so forth, and the structural to make sure that all of these things work together. I think while the central banks have a role in addressing inflation, it would be a mistake for central banks to shoulder the entire burden of inflation, because it could be really distressing. What could happen now is the central bank could say, all right, well, you will raise interest rates to the roof. Guess what? You could get inflation down, but at what cost? You could have extremely high interest rates, investment tanks, production declines, and better inflation comes at the expense of contraction of an economy. So I just wanted to complement the supply-demand dynamics and getting that rigidity out of the way using technology with the macroeconomic thing. And that is even sometimes now there's a discussion as to should central banks bear all this burden of doing that. And in many countries, you have a complementarity, but it's something that needs to be taken into account, especially over the long term. If you have a situation in some countries where you see hyperinflation, well, it's because of a macroeconomic imbalance and too much government spending over things rather than, just supply demand on a micro level.
Can I just support the governor's comments? I agree totally. And should really the central bank shoulder the entire burden? Really and truly, the private sector has to step up and support these fundamental drivers in the economy. I mean, at AmCham has focused on digital transformation, the ease of doing business, building an ESG strategy. Some of the core pillars of AmCham is to push the private sector in this particular direction, drive the private sector to, improve the ease of doing business within their own businesses, to adopt digital transformation, spend and invest now to be able to reap the technology benefits of the future, to take a little bit more risk, to build ESG goals into their agenda. So the private sector, and AmCham is one example, has that responsibility to be able to shoulder some of the burden that the economy faces.
Thank you. Victor, moving on to you. I mean, we have seen this global phenomenon of increases in prices. So how do the countries in the Caribbean can balance the short-term goals of reining in inflationary expectations alongside long-term goals of climate and disaster mitigation? How do we go about doing that through the ADB perspective?
Well, in terms of structural reforms, right, that we could discuss and introduce that would affect long-term growth objectives, one area that we're looking at quite carefully and monitoring is the level of debt that the different countries have across the region, right? So that's something that has been growing across the region during the pandemic and since. And the challenge on that question is that interest rates are very high right now. So it's a delicate, it's a sensitive moment to look at expanding fiscal policies when interest rates are high at this moment. Now, for Trinidad and Tobago, the direction of the fiscal position has actually improved, benefiting from these energy prices. And I'll give you a small example of how we look at these questions of debt sustainability. in the exercises that we work on, if we were looking at what the fiscal position of the government was last year in 2021, we calculated what should the fiscal balance for the different governments be given a given level of interest rate or GDP growth. And so we were getting basically that the fiscal balance of the government was about 5% lower than it could be to maintain that level of GDP growth. So what that means is that basically to improve the fiscal balance by 5% of GDP, you can do two things, or cut spending or increase revenues, right? And that was in 2021. If we look at 2022, what happened between one year and the other? Well, revenues actually increased by more than 5% of GDP, improving the fiscal position. So those are important gains that should be held on to, and the structural reforms that could do so are related to fiscal frameworks and fiscal policies that support it. So the question on debt is a sensitive question across the region in terms of improving the structural situation of the economies. And for Trinidad and Tobago, it has had important tailwinds on that question, right?
Thank you, Victor. We have a question from the floor.
Hi, yes, good day. Ardeen Serju, I represent I-95.5 FM. A couple things. I think the issue of the statistic related to literacy brings into sharp relief the issue of how reliable our data is, and the fact that in 2023, you're still getting a 99% literacy rate from our Central Statistical Office, I think points to a huge deficiency. And I have not really heard the question of data and reliability addressed here, although it has been brought up successively in various reports, international reports, when we talk about Trinidad and Tobago's development. So digitalization is certainly one thing, but data has to be an area that we address. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And also, Mr. Hill, you represent what I think is some more enlightened leadership in the arena of business in Trinidad and Tobago, and in general, in terms of the language we hear when we talk about purpose, sustainability, etc. And I'm wondering, to what extent does that leadership gap affect our ability to transition in the way that is necessary? And I understand that through the Natural Capital Hub, some of that work will be done, but in terms of your peers and your cohorts in that arena, how are you all promoting that kind of enlightened in leadership? To what extent is that important? Thank you.
Thank you. We have two aspects of that question. One is on the reliability of data, and that's what she has raised in terms of international reports. And the other one was your influence as leaders in the business sector and in the financial sector, and how does it resonate across the other sectors and cohorts of leaders that are coming up. So maybe I start off with Governor first.
Yeah, let me start with the data question. I agree with you 100% that data are critical, because we live in a scientific world. Things don't just happen by intuition. I mean, they could, and sometimes you have to rely on it if you don't have anything else. But really, in this day and age, you should be relying on statistics, on empirical analysis, and even on business surveys and so forth to guide you. Otherwise, you may be barking up the wrong tree. In preparing for this presentation, let me give you three things that happened. So I was looking at some social issues, inequality, and education scarring. In inequality, you notice that I mentioned the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US and about their findings about it. In education, I looked at a McKinsey Group report in the US again, and you could find things for Europe. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, you couldn't find it yet. It may be not unusual because we may be just getting there. I remember doing a presentation for the Insurance Institute. And I said, listen, I talked about the pandemic and I talked about climate change. And I cited studies in Australia and wherever and so forth. But I couldn't find anything on Trinidad and Tobago. So I challenged them as an institute, listen, spend your resources to empirically investigate this thing. So I agree with you 100%. And that's why in my remarks on the inequality thing, I said, well, at least we are looking forward to the CSO's survey of living conditions, which I think is underway, for us to have an empirical grounding of what happened in terms of inequality in Trinidad and Tobago broadly, but also different cohorts. How did they react to the pandemic? Also on the education front, we have some anecdotal information, but much could be done to milk that data. So I am 100% on your side. At the central bank, we do what we can. We have a whole statistics department. We are comfortable on the monetary statistics, on money supply, and the financial data. We rely on other agencies for support and for their basic data. As mentioned, the 99% literacy rate, well, we don't get into it in the sense of challenge it per se. We might have some questions, but we rely on it basically, and I think it's good for people to ask more, what does it mean? I think there has been a long-standing promise to reform the national statistical apparatus, move from a CSO to a National Statistical Institute. I think that has not happened yet, and I would urge that reform take place and really understand the social statistics that we have. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done in that area. So I agree with that point.
Mr. Hill?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge and appreciate the comments expressed about the presentation of the themes and thoughts today. I have good news. This thought process and this quality of conversation is permeating throughout the leadership of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm very happy to be part of AmCham, and we had our strategic planning session this week. And the level of discussion really is about trying to support the private sector, to support the country, to move our agenda into a future-fit economy. And so the conversations around digitization and ESG strategy, helping the economy to transition, and where we can impact and raise our voice to change the national conversation, to then move the dialogue in this particular direction to influence and inform a change at the national level and at the entire leadership level. That's the focus. So we see ourselves as playing an important part in changing the conversation. I'm very happy that the leadership of the AmCham is already speaking in that direction. At home at Ansa Makal, very happy to say that the group has taken its ESG agenda very seriously, with a serious commitment to our ESG pillars. We've set KPIs for every company, every managing director to accomplish within a certain time frame. We all will be measured along these metrics. So that's the level of commitment I could say at the Ansa Makal level. And so I am very optimistic that the language, the conversation, and the agenda is changing. But also, the burden must be shouldered by many. So the public, the media, the coverage that you produce in your newspapers and your radio stations, I want to encourage you and challenge you to help us change the narrative together, report on the things that are positive, where there are opportunities, and let's change the national agenda together. Leaders sometimes lead from behind or from the front. It depends on the situation. Sometimes transition takes longer at the leadership level, and therefore the groundswell is what kind of influences the direction of the ship. So I want to put that challenge out there to everyone to be able to change the agenda and the language. But we have a bright future in front of us.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Victor, just briefly on the international statistics and quality related to Trinidad and Tobago.
On the international statistics?
I mean, the international reports that are produced related to statistics in Trinidad and Tobago. Is there any thoughts?
Well, we basically don't question these statistics when they come out. We're using them as they're distributed, right? So, in terms of improving institutional capacity in capturing statistics, that's definitely an area that is important. It's a regional question too, because statistical agencies across the region work together also to share their knowledge and their capacities. But it's a key pillar for decision making and policy analysis. So it's definitely something fundamental.
Thank you. We had a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up given the time. I will now invite, before I invite Mark, maybe if you have any concluding statements if you want to issue or give to the audience before you depart.
Well, I'll go first. I thought that the level of dialogue today was very informative. I also thought that the very good presentation by the governor did set the stage for us to acknowledge the opportunities, the way our economy is structured. I think that the national conversation, taking into account the data that the central bank is producing, gives us a good context and foundation to have a more informed conversation. But it's important for us to have the conversations about where we're going in the future and how all of us as participants in the local economy and at the national level can work together to influence change and prepare us for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Governor.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I want to thank the UNDP and representative for organizing this interesting forum. I think it's quite timely and precise. The one thing I would say is that we have a tremendous potential as a small country. We need to step up, and I think while we're doing so, we cannot delude ourselves. When things go wrong, we have to face it squarely. We have to look at it scientifically. We have to address it, and we have to move forward. Otherwise, we will be left behind. So I think this is a challenge for us to coalesce and to move things forward.
Thank you, Governor. Victor, your last statement.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you very much. Thank the UN for the invitation. I'd like to reiterate a message that I gave and what we've been hearing from the different presenters. The importance of technological development, right? We've heard also from members of the audience that discussed the challenges they face in the business climate. The component or the pillar of a digital transformation to address a lot of these challenges, I don't think cannot be emphasized enough, right? Because it improves productivity, it reduces the cost of doing business, and it strengthens public services and ultimately benefiting the people through an improved business climate. So that's a final comment I'd like to contribute.
Thank you, Victor. Now I invite Mark to just leave his closing remarks as well as thank our panelists and audience.
Thank you all for your patience. I know you were well over time. So I just wanted to thank Mr. Gauto for representing the IDB here today, Mr. Hill for representing Ansa Merchant Bank, the AmCham, and by extension, the local private sector. And especially want to thank the Governor of the Central Bank, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, for giving of his time. His time is very precious, and he went over and above today, so thank you very much. Thanks to Raymond Prasad, the moderator, whose brainchild this session was, and for putting together a very good session. Thanks to Gerardo Noto, representing the UN country team. Again, just the one little order of correction. This was the entire UN coming together to support this venture, not the UNDP, although the UNDP is like the heavy hitter. So I want to thank your respective teams, Karina Coburn, especially from the IDB, the governor's team led by Nicole Crooks, and the rest of her team, Lauren Rosta at Ansa Merchant Bank for putting this together, and Tanya Bailey, Renee Berman-Shepherd, and Fane Richards in the UN Resident Coordinator's Office, and Anika Batista for being so supportive with this event. Finally, thank you all for coming today, taking time out of your schedules to be here, and for staying longer than expected. I hope you gain something from today's session. Thank you very much. Safe journey home, and look forward to seeing you at the next one of these seminars that we host. Thank you.